So hi and welcome to the Data Explorers Market Update, where today I'm reviewing three rather high-profile and hard-hitting reports on the ETF industry and its impact upon financial markets from three extremely powerful organisations: the Financial Stability Board, known as the SFB, not to be confused with the former KGB, who are now called the FSB, so a little joke there, the Bank for International Settlements and the IMF, who have all basically come in and basically question loads of things around ETFs, including the role of securities lending. Now, before we go into that, and let's look at some of the ETFs that the investors who are oblivious to the politics are actually getting involved with, because life continues as usual. And obviously, SPY, the SPDR SP500 one, remains and normally always is the ETF with the most demand, followed by IWM, which is the Powershares QQQ, and then we also have a perennial favourite, which is the MSCI Emerging Markets Tracking Fund from iShares, the EEM. They're always up there. Some of the recent themes, given what's going on with the prevalence for gold, you have the GLD from SPDR, a very popular ETF, people to hedge their exposure to gold. The emerging markets one we've just discussed. We also have a lot of interest in Merrill Lynch's semiconductor index, actually massive interest over the last couple of months in that. And we also have some natural gas plays, two from ETF securities, and then one called UNG, which is the big United States natural gas fund, as people get out of nuclear and get out of oil, going into natural gas, trying to hedge that. Okay, so then what's happening in the sort of political sphere? Well, yeah, there are these three reports calling to question a lot of the ETF things. And before people in the ETF world get too worried, it brought to mind a quote from Oscar Wilde, which is, "What is worse than being talked about is not being talked about." So just bear that in mind if you think that these reports are making you rather depressed. Now, one of the first accusations was a lack of transparency as to what's going on in the ETF land. And well, the physically backed ETF providers have been responding to transparency. BlackRock have come out with the split between the income between the fund manager and the fund, and we also have securities lending income statistics coming from them too. The synthetic replicated ETF boys, meanwhile, are now publishing what they're holding as collateral every day. Deutsche Bank do that, SocGen do that, and ETF securities are going to be doing that from May. So they're willing providers of transparency, and there's more coming. So that's somewhat being addressed. Now, the fact that securities lending is a component of the ETF income means that the people have worked out that securities lending income helps people offer lower total expense ratios, cheaper ETFs through more income. So these reports thought, well, surely the more securities lending they do, the more money they make, therefore they're going to be aggressively pushing stock out of their door and increasing their counterpart risk and the risk of short squeezes and volatility. Well, what they fail to realise is you can't obviously push stocks out the door. You cannot create demand to borrow your securities or your ETFs, even if you want to lend them. Demand is down about 40% from the financial crisis, as we've discussed many times. The fact that demand to borrow is less has not lowered how cheap these funds are, then the expense ratios have not risen as a result of this lower income, i.e. it's not just the securities lending income that makes it possible for people like BlackRock to offer cheap ways to play the markets. Now, the counterpart risk, supposedly all the securities lending means much more business is being done with other banks, and that's creating a counterpart risk which the investor may suffer. Well, what happened when the last counterpart went bust? In the case of Lehman Brothers, well, actually, people in securities lending made money from that. They sold the collateral to buy back what they had on loan to Lehman, and in many instances made money, very few losses there, so it worked quite well. So what is this kind of great counterpart risk it's leading to? There's other things that they are mentioning, and there's articles all over the internet, from the Brogan report to one about the wackiest one I came across is how people are essentially doing some insider trading by buying an ETF and shorting the rest of the instruments apart from a single one. It's a way of having long exposure to a single company in secret. And then another even more wacky report saying people aren't going to be floating their companies because people can short ETFs so easily. So my final say is it's easy to forget that ETFs are a simple, cheap and liquid way to invest in the markets. Well, that's what they're meant to be. People have lost sight of that. And clearly the ETF providers have a way to go to educate their critics. I've written this up rather more neatly and concisely than my Monday ramble here. If you'd like to read the report, and I suggest you do so, please go to dataexplorers.com/news.